Hey, welcome everybody to Brookside's story. And the Brookside is Brookside Christian Reformed Church here on the southeast side of Grand Rapids. My name is Quin Schultze, and I'm a member, and I'm here with...
I'm Paul DeVries. I'm happy to be with you, Quin.
Oh, Paul, this is wonderful. You know, we're both communicators of a sort. I'm an academic type communicator, and I give a lot of speeches and probably almost as many as you give sermons. And one of the things that I love about your preaching is the use of visual illustrations. And I remember you standing up there on one ladder with another ladder right next to you, trying to negotiate these two, one ladder being a little stronger than the other ladder. And I recall what the purpose of that illustration was. Okay.
Well, that's a big compliment, and I appreciate it, Quin. And the reason I say it's a big compliment is I'm aware, my dad used to say in seminary, they always taught him, my dad was a preacher as well, not to use gimmicks, because the problem with a gimmick is that's all people will remember. And there can be some truth to that. People will remember the ladder but have no idea of what it illustrated, right?
I had that happen to me once, where I was speaking at a big youth ministry conference. I gave a terrific presentation about youth, communicating with youth and how important it was to use stories. And so I told a story about one of my children.
Yeah.
And the place was going crazy with humor because it was a funny story. And then afterwards, a guy was there from one of the big Christian magazines. And he came up and he said, I was going to write a story about this convention and all. And one of the things I'm thinking of saying is that you told a great story, but nobody knew what the point was.
Ouch! Ouch, Quin.
Well, he wrote about it, but didn't bring me up, which I was grateful for. But he said your story outdid the point. It was too much.
Yeah. That's interesting that you raise that, because I wrestle with that, right? I mean, I'll confess, I sort of like the dramatic, the surprise, the visual illustration that makes a point. But to ingrain it well without unsettling people.
Yeah, I wondered about that with a recent sermon where, this is the one where you had the little clay pots.
I know where you're going.
So tell us what you did with these clay pots.
Well, I had 12 small clay pots. I think they were 3-inch in diameter, the kind of starter clay pots, cheap to buy, and they represented the 12 apostles, all of whom were going to be upset and crumble under the pressure of Jesus' arrest. Jesus predicts it in Matthew 26. So, I wanted to break the pots as a demonstration of what the disciples were like. And they became brittle and fragile and all the rest. But to make the point, I stacked them all on a tray, and I thought what I'm going to do is I'm going to tip this tray off the front of the pulpit. It will hit the wood in front, and they'll break. And they'll make a terrific noise. And I even rehearsed with a couple to make sure it worked. But then in the sermon, in order to catch the drama of these disciples who think they're solid, confident, useful, getting shattered.
But they're really all broken.
I, as I like to, did this with my hands, and then I intentionally came up, catching the corner of the tray very dramatically. And suddenly, and they all fell down and smashed at once. And the number of people that jumped in the pews, and I thought, maybe that was a little much.
Okay,
right?
I think it was. So it worked. It's a memorable point. But I think you've also could have done it a little more gradually, taken maybe one at a time out and dropped one, dropped another one, and then picked up the whole thing, and people would have known that you were going to throw it over. But people watching this, if they weren't there, they're going to go back and look at it now because they're going to be so intrigued by the sermon. But other people might say to me, Dr. Q, you are just not into it. That was good and dramatic and memorable.
Well, and that's one of the things you learn in preaching anyways, right? It's true about a good exegetical sermon. It's good about a sermon that has a powerful story or an illustration.
So what's your worst story about an illustration that you used that was over the top?
Well, surprisingly, and I still struggle with this because it seems like such a wonderful illustration, but on Easter, I wanted to demonstrate how deflated the disciples were. We think of Easter as celebration day. We were giving out helium balloons to the kids after the service, which we like to do because we had so many visitors, and Jesus rose, helium balloons rise, right? And
Oh boy.
yeah, and I used it in a sermon. I had a bunch of them kind of to the side of the pulpit under a cardboard box hidden by some flowers. I took the cardboard box off the helium balloons, right? This is how we think of Easter.
Oh
here.
boy.
And I think of being Mary Magdalene. She doesn't even know where the body of Jesus is. And I had a pin and I popped a balloon. The congregation jumped. I thought, well, now they know where this is going. And then I sort of one by one, Peter, who had denied Jesus 3 times, Thomas, who's not there for the grand unveil. And I just kept popping these balloons. And here's the weird thing. Every time I popped them, people jumped all over again. And you can see, you already know, right?
That's the Pavlovian response.
So there was a bunch of people that thought, oh, that was wonderful. But there was a huge number of people. In fact, a colleague of mine who I was working with at the time was almost enraged that I had ruined his Easter, and I thought that was a little dramatic. But in hindsight, I understand, and maybe to your point, there's probably a different way, to make that same point.
Yeah,
So,
you know what I thought you were going to say? You had them all filled with helium, you let them go, they went up to the lights, and one after another, they popped all through the rest of the service because of the heat.
And that's why I say, just like musicians rehearse their music in the setting, preachers ought to always rehearse, because good illustrations that work in one setting might not.
All right.
I knew of a guy who let balloons up in a service, and they all hit the ceiling fans that were up top, and they got entangled in them and made noise.
It was bad.
Right? You have always test these things to make sure, right?
So, thank you for sharing that. Memorable. I'll be dreaming about these things tonight. So, if you would like to see what Pastor Paul tries next at Brookside Christian Reformed Church here in Southeast Grand Rapids, you've got to come to a service. Now, you can watch him online, but it won't be the same. You won't be as startled or as surprised. So, go ahead.
And here's the thing. The hope is, the design is, if I get it right, if we get it right collectively, is that these bring home truths that maybe we already know, but we're a forgetful people, we let go of. And it might help you to just sort of hold on.
And the truth of the matter is that we remember better visually.
Correct. Absolutely.
Okay, thanks everybody. We really appreciate it.
God bless.